Ladies and gentlemen, and children of all ages, it's time for the Vic Martino Storybook Time. Very interesting story today. It's called, we're going to read this book here. Very brief, it's not a long read. It's a brief read, but very interesting story. The Boys of Steel, the creators of Superman. Let's get right to it. Boys of Steel, the creators of Superman. By Mark Tyler Nobleman, illustrated by Ross McDonald. Most days, Jerry Siegel slipped into the halls of his high school, staring at the floor. If I'm going to read, I should know how to read. All right, let's take two. Most days, Jerry Siegel slipped into the halls of his high school, staring at the floor. He always wished he were going in the other direction, back home. That's where he could be with his friends. They were an extraordinary bunch. One saved lives in the jungle. One saved lives in space. One saved lives in the future. See, he was into comic books, and the one that saved lives in the jungle was Tarzan. The one in space was Flash Gordon, and the one in the future was Buck Rogers. He read the comic strips. He was a comic strip reader. In those days, there were the comic strips. I don't know if there were comic books yet, but there were comic strips in the newspapers. Anyway, but Tarzan, Flash Gordon, and Buck Rogers were fictional characters. They saved other fictional characters in pulp magazines and comic strips. They couldn't save anyone in the real world, where millions of people were struggling to find jobs during the Great Depression of the 1930s. They couldn't save Jerry's father, who had died of heart failure during an after-hours robbery in his clothing store in Cleveland. Jerry read amazing stories every morning, every weekend, every chance he got. If he wasn't reading, he was watching the movie theaters. If he wasn't reading, he was watching. The cinemas had no shortage of rousing motion pictures about daredevils who laughed at danger. And when he should have been paying attention in class, he let his thoughts drift to galaxies yet to be explored. None of it helped him miss his father less, but it did distract him from his sadness for a little while. Jerry also wrote his own adventure and science fiction stories. He'd pound away at the typewriter by the front window in his attic. From there, he could see boys playing ball and flirting with girls on the street below. Jerry wasn't good at those things. He had crushes on girls who didn't know or didn't care that he existed. Some of them look like they hope I don't exist, Jerry thought. Jerry was shy. Unless he could talk about superheroes or detectives or jetpacks or ray guns or any other champion or gadgets he'd read about. But the kids he knew weren't interested in those weird tales, and they ignored Jerry. Jerry and Joe could have passed for brothers. Both were short, both wore glasses. Like Jerry, Joe was lousy at sports and mousy around girls. He too was shy, almost painfully so, and he too escaped to other worlds in pulps and strips, then made up his own worlds. See, they kind of look alike. And these two wind up creating Superman. Listen. But he did it with pictures, not words. So Jerry was the writer and Joe became the artist. Okay. While Jerry was typing in his attic, Joe was drawing in his kitchen, using a breadboard as a surface. Joe often illustrated Jerry's stories. No matter the obstacle, Joe found a way to draw. When his family couldn't afford art paper, he made do with wrapping paper from the butcher or the back of discarded wallpaper. In winter, because the Shuster's apartment, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, because the Schuster's apartment had no heat, he drew while bundled in several sweaters, one or two coats, even gloves. There he is, see, drawing in the cold apartment, wearing a coat, wearing gloves while he's drawing. This is an interesting story. I hope you're following along. Hope you like my reading. It wasn't just kids who didn't understand Jerry and Joe. One of Jerry's teachers told him he was wasting his time writing what she called trash. But Jerry sensed that these stories were important in life. People got pushed around. Children lost parents. Criminals got away. In short, heroes could prevent all that. And Jerry had a plan. If he and Joe could come up with a colorful new character, they could produce a comic strip about him and maybe sell it to a newspaper syndicate. The partners crafted a science fiction story in cartoons. It starred a brave, tough man who fought for truth and justice, but that wasn't enough to make him stand out from the many other men of action already on the newsstands. After only one publisher said no to Jerry and Joe's concept, Joe tore up the pages in disappointment. Jerry managed to save the cover. So Joe was about to give up after one rejection, but Joe said no. Late one summer night in 1934, Jerry couldn't sleep. The air sagged from the heat, but that was not why Jerry was still awake. What if I was real terrific, Jerry thought? What if I had something special going for me, like jumping over buildings or throwing cars around? Then maybe people would notice me. Jerry knew he would never be able to do anything like that, but suddenly he was struck with the idea of a hero who could. He hopped up to scribble it down. He hopped up from bed to scribble it down. After he flopped back into bed, more vivid details about his hero began flickering in his brain. 2 hours later, he sprang up again, stumbled, and wrote those ideas down. He started creating Superman, what was to be Superman. Before dawn, Jerry tugged on his clothes. He put his clothes on over his pajamas. Why don't they just say that? He dashed out without eating. Jerry didn't run much, but that morning he ran faster than a speeding bullet, 9.5 blocks to Joe's apartment. In breathless spurts, Jerry described to Joe what he imagined. When he was done, Jerry pushed his glasses back up to his nose. He ripped out a sheet from his notebook and handed it to Joe, who grabbed a pencil. Joe leaned close to the paper as he usually did. Jerry leaned over Joe's shoulder as he usually did, even with his glasses on. Joe squinted. He began to sketch. His vision was blurry, but his art wasn't. In seconds, the hero in Jerry's mind was coming to life. All right, not much more to go here. Just as Jerry had written all night, Joe kept drawing all day. His eyes grew tired before his hand, but he was too excited to stop. Jerry had known that this hero would be strong, but it was not until he gazed at Joe's design that he realized how strong. He would be as strong as steel, and because they had created him, Jerry and Joe felt as strong as steel too. The hero was more than good, even more than great. They studied his costume. Let's put something on the front, Joe said. They decided on an S for Super. And now, what are their names? Siegel and Shuster. See? A lot of people don't know that. The S, not just for Super, because their names ended with, their last names started with an S. And that's how they named Superman. The boys thought this hero might be their big idea. They prepared a series of comic strips about him and again set out to find a publisher. For more than 3 years, editors turned them down. Oh, could you imagine these people that are in charge? Finally, one said yes. His company was putting out a new type of magazine called the comic book. See, they used to be comic strips in the newspapers. Now this is a comic book. He asked Jerry and Joe if they would rearrange their comic strips to that format. They happily agreed. One of the owners took one look at Joe's cover drawing and shook his head. "Nobody's going to believe this," he said. What is he talking about? It's a comic book. What is he nuts? But Jerry and Joe believed it, just as they believed Tarzan could yak with apes and Flash Gordon could move to another planet and Buck Rogers could wake from a coma after 500 years. Now, this is what the first Superman comic looked like in Action Comics. That was the cover that they finally did get printed. And we're going to find out how. Okay. The Great Depression had lasted nearly a decade. Now a world war was brewing. Every day people were about to be called to duty, and many would prove to be real-life heroes. But if there was ever a time for a fantasy hero, practically one with powers and abilities far beyond those of mortal men, it was then. People wanted a hero they knew would always come home. Jerry and Joe gave them that. The world's first superhero. He debuted in 1938. His comic book was an instant hit. Soon he also won fans in a comic strip, on the radio, in animated shorts, in books, and in movie serials. When television caught on, he got a show there too. He continued to soar, up, up, and away. It's Superman! Some people look up in the sky and see a bird or a plane, but nothing beyond. In the trying days of yesteryear, Jerry and Joe looked up and saw a star no one had discovered before. They brought him to Earth, watched him become a superstar, and today, on every story where his name appears, theirs do too. All right, now, I'm going to just finish up by saying, they wound up getting these two guys, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, who created Superman, these two kids. You know, they sold the idea to National Publications, which was DC Comics, who wound up ripping them off. I mean, they just paid them like a small salary, and they were making all the money, and then they wound up firing them. Terrible. And what happened eventually, years later, you know, they kept bringing it to court, you know, to try and, because everybody was getting rich off Superman. He was making millions of dollars, except the two guys created him. And then finally, they wound up winning a lawsuit, and they started getting some money, you know, years later. But at least now they're, of course, these two are no longer with us, but their families are getting the money now from Superman. I mean, come on. Okay, now, the next video, I'm going to read one more book, and it's called Bill the Boy Wonder, the secret co-creator of Batman. So I hope you join me for that one.